Very much. I'm delighted to be here this morning to share with you a few thoughts that I have concerning ideas of creativity, passion, and leadership. I thought long and hard about what I would say because there's much to be said about these three aspects of personality and of performance. After long periods of thought, I ended up coming back to the beginning, both metaphorically and also in reality, back to the place where I began. What I'd like to share with you this morning is a story about empowerment. I'd like to share with you a story about a woman who transformed herself from what she was into something that was remarkable and astounding. It is said that passion is in the heart, and if home is where the heart is, then my heart was set abeat by the passion and the life and rhythm of my mother. My mother's name was Ruby Ann Wilson, and she was born in 1927 in a brood of 5. But most often there were 9 people living in a 4-room home in the piney woods of South Carolina. She was distinguished in many ways. One that stood out most in her early life was that she was the first person in her family to graduate from high school. This made her quite a phenomenon in her community. In a community where people rarely went past 5th and 6th grade, this woman was able to achieve something that was almost unthought of. She also happened to be the only person in her family who ever went to high school. The only reason she was able to achieve this goal was because her family was willing to sacrifice the valuable labor that she would have performed in the fields so that this woman could get an education, and the stage was set. In the early late 1940s, she moved to Philadelphia, where she had a brother who moved here after the war. She was a part of this mass migration of African Americans who left the South for places north in droves. Sociologists and historians refer to this as the migration from field to factory. And in fact, that's exactly what happened. Her first job was working at a cigar factory in North Philadelphia, hard in the shadows of Temple University. She worked hard. She worked hard to create independence for herself. She worked hard to create a life for herself. She worked hard to keep the dream alive that she could have a better life for herself and for the child that soon was born early thereafter. In the early part of the next stage of her life, she worked in a factory that cleaned uniforms, service uniforms. Hot, dirty, steamy environment. She never complained, even though she had scars on her hands and her arms from this labor. In fact, she never missed an opportunity to turn to me and say, such is the life of an individual who does not have specialized training, who does not have enough education. Extraordinary. I watched my mother work in labor and mindless jobs for years. One day, I was about 10 or 11, she came home, and in a bag she had 2 frozen pot pies. She said, I want you to read the instructions, I want you to make this, to show me that you can do this without burning down the apartment. I rose to the challenge, I read the instructions, prepared the 2 pot pies, put them on the table, we sat down quietly to eat. I was curious about why my mother would ask me to do something like this. I had never done anything like this before in my life. She looked at me quietly and she said, I've decided to go back to school. And for 3 nights a week, I'm not going to be home in time to make dinner for you. So I want to make sure that you know how to prepare a meal so that you can eat. When I come home, I'll check your homework. She says, I know that this is going to be a challenge for you. It's going to be a challenge for both of us. And I only do this if I think you're going to be all right. She said, I want you to know something. I'm not doing this for me. I'm doing this for us. At that point in my life, I did not really understand the sacrifice involved. In my mind, even as a parent today, I cannot understand what it took. The courage it must have taken inside of this woman to try to bring about such an incredible change in her life. Our lives became a series and spades of events that were governed by the ebb and flow of her classes, colloquiums, places that she had to be. It was extraordinary because I watched her meld the fabric of her life into something that she could only dream of and she had yet to obtain. She would put together vacation time and sick time so that in the summers she could take classes at the University of North Carolina, NYU, and at the University of Chicago. It was an extraordinary thing to watch. No one believed in her. No one believed that she could make it. The people in my community lived what we could only call lives of quiet desperation. They had no reason to believe that education could be the answer to their problems because they had no examples. It is said that those who live without example mindlessly and needlessly stumble. And so it was that this woman took this position of her own, independent of anything that people believed that she could do, and she pressed on. Her workload didn't decrease, neither did her zeal for the quest that she was on. She was in the full throes of passion about attaining something that was intangible and yet she believed would change her life. One day, she was done. She finished. With her hard-won credentials in her hand, she had the fortune to meet a diminutive but wonderful little woman named Ida Brodsky. Ida Brodsky had a novel concept in her mind, to wit, if you feed children before they go to school, they will perform better in school. This was revolutionary in the 60s. Ida Brodsky and my mother got on a train and went to Washington, D.C. and held a two-person sit-in outside the White House. They were sure that if the government understood how important it was, that they would respond and do something about hunger amidst school-age children. They came back to Philadelphia. Actually, somebody gave them a check. They started an organization called Little Neighborhood Centers. In the beginning, they serviced 15 families, and they operated on a shoestring budget. By the time my mother died, the budget was $1.5 million, and they were serving 7,500 families in North Philadelphia. The example of my mother's life is a fit message for educators and for leaders. It is a sign and a message that empowerment still is and should be the responsibility of educators, educated people, and of leaders. My first teaching job was at Edison High School, in a part of North Philadelphia that many people don't even know exists. Predominantly poor, predominantly Hispanic. These young people were some of the most inspirational I've ever met in my life. They live with rampant poverty. They live with violence in their communities. They live with dim hope for the future in front of them. And I was delighted that I was able to bring some spark of positivity to their lives. I realized that all they needed was to know that somebody believed in them, that they could be more than a statistic about teenage pregnancy or mortality rate or their participation in the penal system. They could be full-fledged human beings if someone believed in them. I had something very interesting happen during that time at Edison High School. I had a young man named Juan in my class. Wonderful young man. I loved him. He was such a great kid. In and out of trouble all the time, but he was just one of those kids that you just wanted to take to your heart and protect him. Well, one day there was an essay due and Juan wasn't in class. I said, okay, one of two things has happened. Either one, he's gotten in trouble, he's somewhere probably in jail, or two, he didn't have his essay, and so he didn't want to face me, and he didn't come to school that day. About 5 minutes before the class was over, Juan comes bursting through the door. He's got blood on his shirt. We all were aghast. What happened? We ascertained, in fact, that the blood was not his. I said, what happened to you? He said, Mr. Wilson. He said, man, I was sitting at the table doing my essay, man, and somebody shot my uncle through the living room window. And we spent all day at the hospital praying for him to get better. Wow. I said, well, why didn't you go home and change your clothes before you came to school? He said, man, I didn't want you to take no points off my paper for it being late. There's the jar, Mr. Will. There's a good paper. And he took out of his pocket a balled up hunk of paper and lovingly smoothed out the wrinkles and handed it to me with pride. I knew then that I'd experienced something extraordinary, that this young man had brought into the idea that education had the power to change his life, that it did matter if you did well in school and exercised an intellect that was clearly nascent in him and only needed to be cultivated and motivated. I'm proud to say that each of those kids graduated high school. I know because I sat at the graduation, but my heart is full, as all the parents that sat there. Empowerment is a very important part of what we should do as leaders, as educators, as educated people. It is our duty, just as it was my duty, to empower other people, because my mother empowered me. You as educated people, you as leaders, you must also empower other people to do better, to do more, to be more gracious. I have learned many things in my tenure, and not following in my mother's footsteps was one of the wisest things I ever did, because I came to my own discovery about what education and its empowerment can mean for me. It would have been very easy to step right into her footsteps and follow the mission that she was on, to feed and educate children. But I was a rebel. I was a renegade. I spent many years doing many different things: member of clergy, professional musician, owner of a bar, owned a construction company. And so I enrolled at Temple University to get a degree in business. It was amazing because I was on my way. Things were rolling along. I found a wonderful woman that loved me and that I loved to marry. And things went well until I was in the shower one day and I heard the voice. You know the voice. Bernard, you've got to give something back. Oh my gosh. Not to give something back for you. The next day, I went into school. I changed my major to education. My mother knew that this was a perfect fit for me and that there were so many different kinds of literacies. She began to, in our lives, bring in things that had never happened before. One day I walked into my mother's house. There were a bunch of white people sitting in the living room. What? Two future mayors, Wilson Good and Bill Green, sitting in my mother's living room. Thatcher Longstreth, who was a conservative Republican from Chestnut Hill, sitting in my mother's living room. They were sitting in the living room of a woman who 15 years before had been struggling in a laundry. And here she was, a three-time Liberty Bell Award winner by 3 different mayors. She was regularly on television and radio and in the newspaper. She was being consulted about the plight of children in the inner city by people who were the movers and shakers of this city. And I knew that the power of education to transform lives is a real thing. It is something that must be embraced with our entire being. If we are passionate about what we do, and I don't care what it is you do, then you have the ability to affect other people's lives in the process. In my class, I don't just teach English, I teach life. I talk about the realities of what is for the dreams and goals that these young people have in their minds. You say, well, Mr. Wilson, this is all very interesting, but we're in Arcata University, in sylvan environments, in a suburban school, with a castle, no less. How does this apply to us? Are you, in fact, preaching to the choir because we've already demonstrated our interest in education and in leadership? And I say, perhaps I am. But it's your job to continue to make sure that the choir grows. The last thing I will leave with you is this idea. We have an obligation and a duty to be passionate about what we do. And if you do that, you influence the lives of other people. And in doing so, maybe in some small way, you make the world a little better place. I know that if my mother had stopped at the limitations of ethnicity and gender, that you and I would never have met under these circumstances. I'm passionate about education because I know that it changes lives.